Unpaid care work is the kind of work that people do in taking care of each other and building up each other's capabilities. In particular, very young children, people who are sick, need a pretty significant amount of attention and care. And very often it is women who do this kind of work. The main characteristic of unpaid work is that it's not directly paid or remunerated.
And then I remembered a woman who had 3 children under 5, who was caring for her elderly parents. And nobody seemed to think that at some stage she might actually need some assistance with childcare because she wasn't in the paid workforce. When we look at the amount of time that's taken in the unpaid sector, what we find is that in almost every country where I've ever seen the data, it is the single largest sector of the nation's economy. In the last 3 years, for example, the UK statistician has declared that all of that unpaid work is the equivalent of all manufacturing and all retailing in the UK. In Australia, the single largest sector of Australia's economy is unpaid childcare. And the second largest sector is all the rest of the unpaid work, before banking and insurance and financial intermediation services clock in at the largest part of the market sector.
The labor that is unnamed and certainly not valorized, and that is housework, which allows us to function in this world, which allows us to escape the pangs of hunger, which allows us to appear clean and orderly, which allows us to find our clothing in the morning and wear it well, which allows us to be comfortable, which allows us an aesthetic surrounding, which allows us escape from the diseases that you get from filth, that crucial work that is unnamed and unrecognized.
A 9-to-5 day is just a dream for a lot of women. Many work a double day, slogging away at their job and then going home to clean, cook and look after children. And they're not paid for the second shift. In fact, the work's not even counted. So all that toil before 9 and after 5, all the nappies changed and dishes washed and laundry hung by stay-at-home mums, orthodox economists don't add it into their calculations. They put all that slogging down to choice. Women want to have children, to warm the hearth, to mop grime from the floors. It's a labour of love.
Whilst males conducted significantly more transport-related activities, such as dropping off children at school or friends' homes, women outperformed their male partners in all other categories. Males doing 16 hours of unpaid labour to their partners who did 26 hours. 3 out of every 4 mothers are in employment in the UK compared to 92.6% of fathers, which may account for a small portion of the differences in unpaid labour between males and females, with fathers being more likely to be working than mothers. Fathers are more likely to be employed than other males who have no dependent children. Women who had dependent children were more likely to be employed than women without dependent children, something that would support the idea of an increase in dual earner families. Belfi and Leonard suggested that social expectations of women were to blame for women doing more, with the domestic sphere being stereotypically seen as being a reflection of a woman's competence in the home. Social class also has an impact, with many middle-class mothers outsourcing domestic labour, something which has been debated recently amongst academics, with some claiming that having domestic help is a form of empowerment that enables them to work, while others suggest it is a form of social class oppression. Khan and Laurie recently suggested that education impacts on the level of equality in households, with more educated women, those with degrees and above, often having more equality in domestic work with their partners. Crompton and Lynette went further and suggested that the level of income women bring into the household indicated the level of domestic work that their partners carried out. The larger the share of income they brought into the household, the more their partner did in unpaid labour.
As you have noted, most of the focus on unpaid labor is largely the time provided by women in households. The examples provided offer a narrowed approach to looking at what constitutes men's and women's contributions to households. Even though men provide the noted 16 hours of unpaid labor, the primary focus is on 26 hours provided by women. This narrowed approach to looking at unpaid labor really informs policymaking, especially in developed countries. You realize that most programs aimed at subsidizing childcare, for example, focus largely on women's contributions to childcare, with little to no focus on men's contribution to the same. That is because the campaign on unpaid labor is largely dominated by women and related organizations. How about a holistic view of unpaid labor? What exactly constitutes unpaid labor? The Toksic Theory of the home state that unpaid labor cannot exist without uncompensated resources, while uncompensated resources can exist without unpaid labor, as in the case of unpaid labor ceasing to be unpaid, especially when outsourced. Just like other theories, this theory also has assumptions. The first assumption is that all those who fight for women's equality actually believe in equality for all women, irrespective of their social status or level of education. The second assumption is, all those who run campaigns focusing on the gender pay gap and advocating for equal pay for the same job actually believe in equal pay for all the jobs, from the highest paying to lowest paying. Let us define some terms. First, unpaid labor is widely defined as work that is not directly compensated and includes cooking, cleaning, and caring for others, especially children and the elderly. Second, uncompensated resources refer to those resources that facilitate the undertaking of unpaid labor, for instance, food, rent, clothing, school, or tuition fees, among others. It is worth noting that labor is one of the 4 factors of production, with others including capital, entrepreneurship, and land. Labor compensation refers to the cost of securing the services of labor, which is calculated in terms of the base wage and benefits. In examining all the factors of production cumulatively, the reward for labor is wages and salaries, entrepreneurship is profits, land is rent, and capital is interest. Now put a pin on this economics. We will revisit them later on because labor is compensated using wages in all institutions, except in marriage where it is or should be compensated using assets or profits. So now let us examine our theory in 2 contexts. The first context involves the traditional caregiving woman who does not work but instead stays at home and takes care of all the related responsibilities. The second context encompasses the modern empowered woman who actively engages in economically viable activities that generate income, or what is nowadays referred to as the independent woman. The first part, which is unpaid labor, cannot exist without uncompensated resources, focuses on the traditional woman. Unpaid labor then becomes everyday work at home, including cooking, cleaning and let's say taking care of the children. This unpaid labor requires uncompensated resources. For instance, cooking requires food or groceries. In the case of a traditional household, the man buys the food or the groceries and the woman prepares the meal. So for there to be a meal on the table, the man has to provide the uncompensated resource, which is the food or the groceries, and the woman is required to provide what is termed as unpaid labor by preparing the meal. Take cleaning as the second example. For cleaning to take place, say cleaning the house, there has to be a house in the first place to be cleaned, then all the cleaning products, and the water. Considering that most people rent homes as opposed to owning them, the man has to provide the uncompensated resources, which include paying the rent for the house, buying the cleaning products, and paying for the water and electricity bills. Then the woman provides the unpaid labor of cleaning the house. Finally, let us examine caring for say children and the elderly. Let us focus on children. When it comes to raising children, I believe time and resources are equally important. Caring for children entails feeding them, bathing them, putting them to sleep, and when they are a bit grown, taking them to school. Feeding the baby, just like cooking, required the actual meal and the action of feeding the baby. Bathing the baby, just like cleaning, requires the baby's bathing products and the water, which are the uncompensated resources, and the bathing process, which is what is termed as unpaid labor. Putting the baby to sleep requires them to be fully dressed, a crib or a bed, and beddings. These account for the uncompensated resources that facilitate the unpaid labor of putting the baby to sleep. Taking the kids to school, which is part of the unpaid labor in the context of caring for children, requires school fees to be paid and all the necessary resources to be bought, including uniforms, books, and everyday snacks and meals, all of which count for the uncompensated resources. As mentioned before, labor and resources are equally important. Let's get back to the interdependence between time and resources, in this case unpaid labor and uncompensated resources, in raising a child. For instance, if the food is available, and there is no one to feed the baby, the food is useless. If the labor is available and the food is not there, then the labor is pretty much useless. If the labor was more important than the resources, as is presented in divorce court that highlights the unpaid labor and ignores all the relevant uncompensated resources, why then is child support necessary? A common argument, as highlighted here by UN Women, unpaid work results in women having less time to engage in paid labor or work long hours, when combining paid and unpaid labor. So if time spent in doing unpaid labor could be used to engage in other viable economic activities, which makes sense by the way, couldn't the same be said for uncompensated resources? To be specific, couldn't the uncompensated resources be used in the other profitable ventures such as investments? So then, what happens to the family structure? Those who counter the validity of the gender pay gap often highlight the fact that men work, on average, more hours than women, with these hours translating to more income. Those who support the existence of the gender pay gap, in addressing why women work less hours than men, raise the argument that women take more time off work to undertake unpaid labor, which includes doing housework and caring for the children. According to Pew Research, the difference in working hours between a woman with kids and one who does not have kids is 3 hours. Now, these 3 hours are what is counted as engaging in unpaid labor. The difference in working hours between a man who has kids and one who does not have kids is 7 hours. So the presence of kids affects women's working hours by 3 hours, while it affects men by 7 hours. I could almost sense some arguing that not all the money earned by men in the 7 extra hours goes into the uncompensated resources of raising children and sustaining a home. Similarly, one could also argue that not all the 3 hours taken off work by women goes into unpaid labor, as some of it could go into leisure, such as massages, time out with the girls, going shopping, going to the movies, and maybe networking. This research also finds that when combining both paid and unpaid labor, fathers work 2 more hours than mothers, but who's counting right? Now, in the wake of divorce and matrimonial property has to be divided and alimony has to be paid, through the argument that unpaid housework cannot be quantified, women, especially mothers, have the 26 hours of unpaid labor and the 3 hours taken off work factored in during the relevant cases. Who factors in the 16 hours of unpaid labor and 7 extra hours worked by men because of the children? Working long hours is responsible for approximately 750,000 deaths every year, with the leading causes of death being stroke and heart diseases. 72%, which translates to over 540,000 of the 750,000, of those who die because of working long hours are men. So if by the laws of association in mathematics we did 72% of 1.9 million, we get that 1.368 million men die in the workplace every year. This 72% is according to the World Health Organization, while some reports place the number even higher. For instance, according to this chart by the United States Department of Labor, women make up 46% of the workforce and 8% of the workplace-related deaths. This other chart shows a comparison of workplace-related fatalities by gender between 2003 and 2018 in the United States. When discussing the gender pay gap, why is the inequality of work-related deaths often ignored? Some scholars say it is because men are raised to be disposable. Anyway, we will get back to this part of male privilege in a different video. But in presenting unpaid labor as a source of inequality, do we factor in the uncompensated resources? Who cares about the 7 extra hours worked by fathers even when they contribute to increased work-related deaths? The second part of the theory examines instances where unpaid labor is not unpaid anymore, especially when it is outsourced.